Mark and Danielle thought they were just chasing excitement. Chris and Laura believed it was only a game between friends. But what began as a daring wife swap experiment spiraled into obsession, betrayal, and ultimately, murder. Behind the smiles of two ordinary suburban couples hid a secret so dangerous that it destroyed everything in its path. This is not a story about fantasy. It's a story about how temptation can twist into obsession and how obsession can end in blood. It started with laughter, the kind that bubbles up when friends have had a few drinks and feel safe enough to push boundaries. Mark and Danielle had been close to Chris and Laura for years. They were the kind of couples who spent holidays together, hosted barbecues in the summer, and trusted each other enough to share the secrets most people keep hidden. One night, while the four of them sat around a fire pit in Chris and Laura's backyard, the conversation took a turn. Someone nobody could later remember exactly who joked about trading partners, just to see what it would be like. At first, it was brushed off, dismissed with smirks and eye rolls. But the seed had been planted. Over the next few weeks, the joke kept resurfacing, a playful nudge here, a sly comment there, until eventually it didn't feel like a joke anymore. The four of them began speaking about it openly, disguising their curiosity as humor. Just imagine, one of them would say, if we actually did it? The air always grew heavier after those remarks, but no one ever shut the idea down. For Mark and Danielle, life had become somewhat routine. They loved each other, yes, but years of marriage had dulled some of the spark. Chris and Laura felt the same. Both couples carried an invisible weight of boredom, the sense that their lives had become predictable. That unspoken dissatisfaction made the fantasy of swapping partners seem less outrageous. It was dangerous, but it promised something different, something thrilling. The night they decided to act on it, there wasn't much planning. A few glasses of wine, a quiet agreement, and then the line was crossed. What began as laughter transformed into something more serious, and in that moment, the fantasy became real. The next morning, nothing looked different from the outside. The same houses stood on the same streets, the same neighbors waved from across the lawns. But inside, something irreversible had happened. The couples could never go back to who they were before. At first, it felt like a victory against the monotony of ordinary life. They were exhilarated, charged with the energy of having shared a secret few would ever understand. The experience bonded them even closer, or so it seemed. They promised each other it was just for fun, just a harmless adventure, nothing more. But when people play with boundaries like this, control is often the first thing to slip away. You ever noticed how small temptations can spiral into something much larger? One moment, it feels like a game, and the next, it's reshaping your entire life. Comment below, would you ever take a risk like this, or would you walk away before things went too far? And while you're here, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that dive into the darkest corners of human choices. The couples thought they had contained it, but small cracks started to appear. A glance that lingered too long, a message that felt more personal than it should have. Mark noticed Danielle smiling at her phone late one night. Chris seemed more eager to stop by their house without Laura. The lines between friendship, fantasy, and reality blurred. But no, I wanted to admit it. What made it even more dangerous was how ordinary it all seemed from the outside. These were people who held steady jobs, paid their bills, and waved politely to their neighbors. To the world, they were just another pair of couples, enjoying suburban life. But behind closed doors, they were walking down a path that had only one ending: chaos. The first chapter of this story is not about violence or betrayal. It's about temptation. It's about how quickly a single idea, spoken aloud, can grow into something no one knows how to stop. And perhaps the most chilling part is this: none of them felt they were doing anything wrong. They convinced themselves it was consensual, adventurous, even healthy. But desire has a way of twisting logic, and soon, what seemed like harmless fun would evolve into something far darker. Imagine sitting with friends you trust, laughing about something wild, and realizing later that the laughter was just a mask for curiosity. That's how it started for Mark, Danielle, Chris, and Laura. 4 friends, 2 couples, 1 idea. An idea that seemed harmless until it wasn't. And here's the question for you. Do you think they could have stopped after that first night? Or was the damage already done the moment they let fantasies slip into reality? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Because as you're about to see, this wasn't just the beginning of an adventure. It was the first step into an obsession that none of them were prepared to face. Chris told himself it was harmless. At first, he believed the connection with Danielle was just a side effect of the swap and afterglow, nothing more. But over time, his feelings deepened into something he couldn't control. He began thinking about her constantly, replaying every glance, every moment, until the fantasy wasn't just about desire anymore. It was about ownership. Danielle wasn't Mark's wife in his mind. She was the woman he was meant to be with. Danielle, on the other hand, felt the weight of regret. What started as curiosity had left her unsettled. She loved her husband and wanted to move on, but Chris didn't make that easy. He texted her late at night, often with messages that crossed the line from playful to disturbing. At first, she ignored them, thinking he would stop. Instead, his persistence grew. He began showing up at the coffee shop where she worked part-time, sitting for hours just to watch her. Danielle confided in Mark that she felt uncomfortable, but she left out the full truth. She didn't want to admit just how far things had gone, and she hoped she could fix it quietly. Meanwhile, Laura felt herself disappearing in her husband's world. Chris barely looked at her anymore. The man she had married seemed consumed by someone else, and the resentment gnawed at her. She knew Danielle wasn't encouraging him, but that didn't matter. The betrayal cut just as deeply. Every time she caught Chris scrolling through his phone late at night, every time he ran errands that took him past Danielle's workplace, the anger inside her grew. Laura had once been the one to laugh loudest at the idea of swapping partners. But now, she saw it for what it truly was. A mistake that had cracked open something dark inside all of them. Chris, however, felt no guilt. He convinced himself that Danielle secretly wanted him, that her hesitations were just fear of judgment. He read into every small interaction, twisting reality to fit the story he wanted to believe. When she avoided him, he took it as a challenge, rather than a rejection. When she smiled politely in public, he saw it as confirmation that she couldn't resist him. His obsession blinded him to the destruction he was causing. Think about it for a moment. How often do people misread signals, seeing what they want instead of what's real? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you're finding this story unsettling already, hit that like button to let us know you're still with us as we unravel this chilling descent into obsession. Mark started noticing changes to Danielle was more distant, more cautious, as if she were carrying a secret. He didn't yet realize just how much Chris had crossed the line, but suspicion lingered in the back of his mind. He thought the swap had ended after that one night. He thought life was moving back to normal. But the way Danielle flinched at the sound of her phone vibrating told him something wasn't right. Behind closed doors, Chris began fantasizing about a future where Danielle was his. He started imagining what life would be like if Mark were out of the picture completely. His obsession wasn't just emotional anymore, it was growing dangerous. He began driving by their house at night, sometimes parking down the street to watch the lights inside. To him, it wasn't stalking. It was waiting for his chance. Laura finally confronted Chris. She told him she could see what was happening, that his fixation was destroying their marriage. Instead of listening, he dismissed her as jealous and controlling. Her words only made him more determined to pursue Danielle. Laura's anger hardened into bitterness, and the tension in their home became unbearable. She had once thought she could compete for his attention, but now she realized she was already losing a fight she could never win. Danielle grew increasingly fearful. She began avoiding places where she thought Chris might show up. She stopped answering his messages altogether, but silence only made him more desperate. He left notes under her car windshield, little reminders that he was still there, still waiting. She told herself it was just a phase, that he would get tired and move on. But deep down, she felt the truth pressing against her. This was only the beginning. This is the moment where fantasy stopped being a game. The excitement, the curiosity, the thrill, all of it was gone. What remained was a dangerous obsession that neither couple could control. And here's the chilling question: at what point do you think the line was crossed? Was it when Chris sent that first late-night message? Or was it much earlier, the moment the couples agreed to step into forbidden territory? Comment your take below, because as this story unfolds, you'll see how a single decision spiraled into something none of them could escape. The tension was building like a storm. The laughter that had once filled their weekends together was replaced with silence, suspicion, and fear. Each day brought new cracks in their carefully crafted lives. And though none of them knew it yet, those cracks were about to split wide open. The obsession had already taken root. All it needed was the right moment to explode into something irreversible. The breaking point didn't arrive suddenly. It built slowly, like pressure inside a sealed container, with each day adding more weight until the inevitable happened. Mark had been uneasy for weeks. He noticed how often Danielle looked over her shoulder, how she jumped when her phone buzzed, how her smile faded the second she read certain messages. He couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, when she left her phone unattended on the counter, curiosity and suspicion got the better of him. What he found was more than enough to confirm his worst fears. Message after message from Chris filled the screen. Some pleading, some demanding, all dripping with an intensity that crossed every boundary. Mark's hands shook as he scrolled. He wasn't just angry, he was betrayed, confused, and humiliated. This wasn't part of the deal. What had started as a shared fantasy now looked like an affair, even if Danielle wasn't encouraging it. The trust between friends, the trust between husband and wife, was shattered in an instant. That night, Mark confronted Danielle. His words were sharp, his face red with rage, and though Danielle swore she had tried to shut Chris down, Mark's trust in her was already crumbling. He demanded she cut off all contact immediately, but deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Chris was no longer acting like a man dabbling in temptation. He was acting like a man possessed. After Danielle stopped responding to him, his behavior escalated. He started parking outside their house, sitting in his car with the headlights off, watching the shadows move through their windows. He found ways to cross paths with her in public, always pretending it was coincidence. And every time Danielle pulled away, it only seemed to fuel him further. Laura had reached her own breaking point. Living with Chris had become unbearable. His obsession with Danielle wasn't subtle anymore. It was glaring, and it consumed everything. She tried reasoning with him, tried reminding him of their vows, their years together, the life they had built, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. He brushed her off, dismissed her pain, and even lashed out at her for standing in his way. Laura's heartbreak turned into a smoldering resentment, and that resentment was about to push her into dangerous territory of her own. The group of four who once shared laughter and secrets no longer met for dinners or casual weekends. The air between them was poisoned, every interaction charged with suspicion and hostility. Danielle felt trapped. Mark simmered with anger. Laura burned with bitterness. And Chris fed off his obsession until it eclipsed everything else. What had once been playful experimentation was now a fractured battlefield. The real fracture came on a stormy evening when Mark disappeared. That day, he had been tense, pacing the house as thunder rattled the windows. Danielle remembered him muttering that he was going to confront Chris once and for all, to end this nightmare. He left the house after dinner, promising he'd be back soon, but hours passed, and he never returned. Danielle's calls went unanswered, and when she checked the driveway in the middle of the night, his car was gone. The following morning, Police found Mark's car, abandoned by the edge of a nearby lake. The driver's door was unlocked, and the keys were still inside. At first glance, it could have looked like he had simply walked away, but something about the scene felt wrong. There were no footprints leading away from the car, no signs of struggle, no logical explanation for why he would vanish without a trace. Investigators searched deeper. What they found was chilling. In the trunk of Chris's car, small traces of blood were discovered, matched later to Mark. It wasn't enough to explain everything, but it was enough to raise alarms. Danielle was devastated, consumed by guilt and fear. Laura, in a strange twist, came forward with her own suspicions, admitting that Chris had grown unstable, violent even, in the weeks leading up to Mark's disappearance. What had begun as a twisted fantasy was unraveling into a nightmare of obsession, betrayal, and now potential murder. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture. Chris wasn't just infatuated, he was dangerous. And with Mark missing, the truth was closing in. The storm that had been brewing for months had finally broken open, and the damage it left behind was only beginning to reveal itself. What none of them knew then was just how far Chris had already gone, and how much darker the story was about to become. Chris could not hide the storm that raged inside him any longer. For months, his obsession had grown unchecked, feeding on every stolen glance, every imagined sign from Danielle, every argument he twisted into proof that she wanted him as much as he wanted her. By the time Mark confronted him, Chris was no longer capable of reason. To him, this wasn't about friendship or betrayal anymore. It was about removing the man who stood in the way of his fantasy becoming reality. On that stormy evening, when Mark left his home determined to put an end to the nightmare, Chris was already waiting. He had asked Mark to meet under the guise of clearing the air, convincing him that they could finally settle things. But there was nothing honest about his intentions. When the confrontation escalated, Chris snapped. Fueled by rage and a twisted sense of entitlement, he attacked. The violence was quick, brutal, and irreversible. Mark's life ended not in a calculated plan, but in a frenzied moment of obsession unleashed. Afterward, Chris panicked, though part of him believed he had done what was necessary. He moved Mark's body, trying to cover his tracks, but his attempts were sloppy. The blood in his trunk, the inconsistencies in his story, and the growing suspicions of those closest to him all began to close in. He parked Mark's car near the lake, hoping to stage the disappearance as a mystery. But the cracks in his plan were visible from the very beginning. Danielle's world crumbled as the truth surfaced. For days, she held out hope that Mark was alive, clinging to the belief that maybe he had run away, maybe he just needed space. But when investigators confirmed the blood evidence, denial became impossible. The guilt consumed her. She had never wanted any of this. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she had played a role in opening the door that let Chris's obsession in. Every memory of that first night, every laugh that seemed harmless at the time, replayed in her mind like a haunting echo. Laura's reaction was different. She was devastated by the reality of what her husband had done, but she was also relieved, in a bitter, twisted way. She had known for weeks that Chris was unraveling, that he was capable of something terrible. When investigators questioned her, she didn't hold back. She spoke of his erratic behavior, the late-night drives, the obsessive fixation with Danielle. Her testimony became a key part of the case that sealed Chris's fate. During the trial, Chris showed no remorse. He framed his actions not as a crime, but as a desperate act of love. He claimed Danielle had been leading him on, that Mark had provoked him, that he was a victim of passion. But the evidence told another story. Witness accounts, phone records, and the physical traces left behind made it clear. This was no accident, no moment of weakness. It was the inevitable outcome of an obsession that had been allowed to grow unchecked. The jury took little time to deliberate. Chris was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. In the courtroom, Danielle sat with her head bowed, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Laura wept openly, her marriage reduced to ashes, her life forever tied to the man who had destroyed another family. The aftermath left scars that would never heal. Danielle withdrew from public life, unable to face the stares and whispers of a community that once admired her family. She carried the weight of guilt every day, knowing that one reckless decision had opened the door to tragedy. Laura rebuilt, her life alone, haunted by the memory of the man she had once loved and the monstrous truth of what he had become. And Chris, locked away, clung to his delusions. In his mind, he was still the man who had fought for love, not the man who had thrown it all away for a fantasy. His obsession never truly died, only rotted behind prison walls. A chilling reminder of how desire can twist into destruction. This story ends not with closure, but with a warning. A single decision, a single night of temptation, spiraled into betrayal, obsession, and murder. It is a reminder that the boundaries we think we can control can break far more easily than we imagine. And once they break, the consequences can be deadly.